So let's get started, shall we, with Donald Trump and the criminal probe. Donald Trump might be facing a criminal probe. As we know, the DOJ has been sort of circling around this issue for quite some time, and now there's new evidence from news sources that it may be closer towards an indictment than we ever thought. As you can see, we are on our mind map, and here in this node, we've got several different bits that we're going to attend to today. First and foremost, the main story comes over from the Washington Post, and the Washington Post is reporting that there is an actual criminal probe well underway. And we've been following and covering the January 6th hearing for a long period of time. Basically, every single one of them we've touched on or talked about. The first three we covered in depth. But the big question is, what's going to come of those? Are they going to make a criminal referral? Yes or no? We don't know. And now Merrick Garland, the head of the DOJ, the Attorney General of the United States, he is communicating a little bit more about this. And the Washington Post is simultaneously reporting. They published this on July 26th. They tell us the Justice Department is investigating Trump's actions because they actually have a criminal probe. And it's not just like speculative. They actually have some concrete reports that they're examining Trump's conversations and they're examining phone records seized from Trump aides, right? So an actual political prosecution of political enemies. So Biden is a Democrat. He runs the executive branch as the president, and he is prosecuting through, I don't know what's going on here, whether there's warrants, whether there's wiretaps or what, but there's a criminal prosecution of Donald Trump, who may or may not be announcing and running and winning again the next presidency, the next election. We'll see. The Justice Department is investigating the president, prosecutors who are questioning witnesses before a grand jury, right? Prosecutors, not January 6th committee people. Department of Justice prosecutors. 4 people familiar with the matter are now reporting this over to the Washington Post. Now, most of these media entities are garbage, so just take it for what it's worth. But they're saying it's true, and there's 4 people there. Prosecutors, including 2 top aides to Vice President Mike Pence, have asked in recent days about conversations with Trump, his lawyers, people in his inner circle, and so on and so forth. Both spoke on condition of anonymity so that they don't get caught. Prosecutors have asked hours of detailed questions about meetings that Trump led in December and January 2021, his pressure campaign, according to them, to overturn the elections, and instructions that Trump gave to his lawyers about fake electors and so on. Some of the questions focused directly on the extent of Trump's involvement and so on. They talked about John Eastman and Rudy Giuliani, both of whom we've talked about. In addition, the Justice Department investigators that are leaked now through this source to the Washington Post, in April, they received phone records of key officials and aides in the Trump administration. Right. So this is beyond just Liz Cheney now, who is just rummaging through everybody's garbage. These are U.S. attorneys. These are U.S. prosecutors who are now trying to cobble together a case. Why? For an indictment. Now, I have long speculated that there was not going to be an indictment because it would be completely unprecedented and it would be something that would open a can of worms and I think really sort of awaken a sleeping giant to some degree. And I think it would be a political, constitutional, I think it would be sort of a mistake of epic proportions. And I think it would be so stupid that they wouldn't do it, but they might actually do it because they are that stupid. Now, they are thinking about it, and they're actually forming this probe going after Trump and apparently Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, according to 2 people familiar with the matter. It's another indicator of how expansive the probe is. Washington Post and other news organizations have previously written that they are examining the conduct of Eastman, Giuliani, and others, and that has not been a surprise, okay? The idea that Bannon and Navarro and all of these other individuals, everybody else is fair game, right? That's obvious. That was always going to be obvious. But the president is a whole different ballgame, right? That's somebody who's sort of untouchable for criminal prosecution, and many people, I think, sort of gloss over this, right? There's a reason for that. The point is, we don't want people prosecuting political opponents in this country. We want to reserve that for the ballot box. We want to say, look, if somebody does something bad in office, okay, well, look, you can prosecute them. I mean, it's got to be like, overwhelmingly egregious. Otherwise, they're out of there in 4 years. And one of the mechanisms that prevents this from happening, prevents a criminal from governing, is the check that is called the power of the people. The people every so often get the opportunity to throw somebody out. And if they don't like that person, they'll throw them out. And if they think that they're an insurrectionist, they'll throw them out. And if they don't, then they won't throw them out. But the problem with this is that they know that most of the country doesn't think or is engaged in this conversation about this alleged insurrection. And so they have to tip the scales. They've got to take advantage of the current sort of environment to try to create this narrative that removes Trump from the field. That's the story over from the Washington Post. Now, that dropped very conveniently, you'll know, at about 6:58 p.m. Eastern time on July 26. And that was, I think, very nicely timed with Merrick Garland, who was also having a conversation over on NBC with Lester Holt. Lester Holt is this guy, and we played this clip of Merrick Garland yesterday. Of course, he's the attorney general, so he makes these decisions. And he's going to be the ultimate final arbiter of whether there is an indictment against Donald Trump, right? The decision is going to lie with him. Or maybe Lisa Monaco, who I sort of suspect is really in charge of the office over there. But regardless, somebody at the DOJ is going to make a decision, and then they will decide whether to indict a former president. And everybody on the sidelines has been just as gleeful as can be. All the Democrats, all the media anchors, Jake Tapper, Liz Cheney, everybody just sort of, what's going to happen? Is he going to be indicted? Merrick Garland, what do you say about this?
Justice without fear or favor. We intend to hold anyone who was criminally responsible for the events surrounding January 6th, for any attempt to interfere with the lawful transfer of power from one administration to another, accountable. That's what we do. We don't pay any attention to other issues with respect to that.
So if Donald Trump were to become a candidate for president again, that would not change your schedule or how you move forward or don't move forward?
Say again.
Okay, so this is a very important question that Lester asked. And this is something, the media is now asking. You and us here, we've been talking about this for months now. What happens if Donald Trump announces first and they indict him? Now they've indicted an actual candidate for president, right? Somebody who's already won and somebody who very likely could run again. This is not somebody like a Bernie Sanders, right? Who is just not going to win because it's just not going to happen. But sorry about that, everybody. But the problem is here, he could be an actual candidate, and he's got a huge swath of people in this country, whether you want to admit it or not, who are very animated and highly supportive of him. So what happens if he runs? He says, I'm in, and everybody's now animated. We're supporting him. He gets indicted. Holy moly. I think even people on the fence will go, wait a minute, what? I think more people would be animated and agitated to support him than more people would be turned off by the indictment. I would guess. Speculative. I have no idea if that's true or not. But it's a very important question. Why is Lester asking about it? Because people are concerned that if Trump does announce that Mr. Garland is not going to then move forward, right? It's going to dissuade him from making the prosecution a real thing. So they're asking him, if he announces, if he says he's going to run, are you going to get scared and then stop prosecuting him because he's announced now? What's going to happen? And he says, listen,
that we will hold accountable anyone who was criminally responsible for attempting to interfere with the legitimate, lawful transfer of power from one administration to the next.
Okay, so he doesn't say anything about the timeliness. He's not saying, yes, we're going to get him before or after or whatever, but he's just saying, look, we're going to follow it wherever it leads. I don't care if he's announced or not announced, is really what he's saying, right? Nothing is going to deviate him from his decision, whether he runs or not. We have another clip from him. Now, he describes sort of his experience on January 6th. And we get a lot of these questions from people in the media. They say, tell me about January 6th in your personal experience. And they say, keep it personal. Because I want to hear the emotion. I want to hear the impact and how this really felt to you. And, some of this stuff has been laughed off a little bit. Like we listened to Jake Tapper talk to Boris Johnson, and Boris Johnson was like, yeah, it was a weird day. Remember, Jake was like, it was a horror tragedy. Boris Johnson said, it was a little bit weird. Jake Tapper said it was more than weird. Johnson said, well, it was a pretty weird day. I'll say that. He said weird 3 times. But they want this sort of this agreement, this virtue signaling about how horrific this day was. And now that question is going to go to Merrick Garland. And honestly, he doesn't really throw out a bunch of emotional stuff. It's just kind of like, yeah, it was an important day.
Let's start off and talk about January 6th. We've just watched weeks of some pretty horrific testimony about what led up to January 6th and what happened that day. Just as an American, can you tell me what your impression was of what we heard?
It's an important part of democracy that every American recognizes the truth of what happened on January 6th and in the area.
I would love the truth.
Yes. I think that this is an important part that we not downgrade or suppress how important that day was. And I think that the hearings did an extremely good job of reminding us, and for people who didn't know in the first place, telling us how important that day was and what a risk it meant for our democracy.
What a risk it meant for our democracy, right? So, okay. Not a real like dripping statement. Some of the statements are dripping. Like Joe Biden said, it was the worst thing since the Civil War. You go, what? Are you nuts? So it wasn't like that, right? Not a ton of hyperbole, but enough there that you go, okay, what's he going to do, right? Is he going to indict him or not? And so those statements came out. We had back-to-back Washington Post, drop it. Garland, drop it. Trump criminal probe, we know, is well underway. The DOJ, through Merrick Garland, is now announcing they don't care if he announces or not. He's going to get indicted if the evidence will lead them there. And so now we have to take a look at the people who are gathering the evidence. Of course, we have Adam Schiff. Many people call him pencil neck because of the size of his neck. Other people call him watermelon head because of the size of his head. It's hard to make a decision on that. You be the decider. Here he is now, very gleeful about what Merrick Garland just said. Some of that activity from that interview, he's able to extrapolate the following.
I think the Attorney General today was saying all the right things, and I noticed a difference, at least I perceived a difference between what he'd been saying earlier about focusing on all those involved in the attack on January 6th, and now talking more broadly about the overall plot to overturn the election. So I would hope that if the department is truly following the evidence wherever it leads, it will recognize it has been leading to Donald J. Trump.
Okay, so he's like really encouraging him, follow the evidence where it leads. You're going to see that it leads to Donald J. Trump. And he's talking about that change, right? That Merrick Garland is saying, yes, we're going to follow the evidence. And, it doesn't matter if he announces or what. He's excited about it. Now, there was also another clip here from Alyssa Farah, who is a former comms person from the Trump White House. And I think, I have a couple of clips here from her. Yeah, former Trump White House communications director, Alyssa Farah. She's at Alyssa Farah on The View. And she says part of Trump's rationale is that if Trump announced, Merrick Garland can't take him on. I think the statement from Garland is to say that's not true, right? So she's sort of speculating, and she says something interesting, like she used to be in Trump's orbit. Here she is.
Listen, I think that Merrick Garland, the Attorney General's remarks were very significant because what I've been hearing from Trump world, I do still talk to some people who are in that broader orbit, is that he's moving up his announcement for president for the future cycle.
Moving up his announcement for the future cycle, right? Something we've been talking about a lot. Is he going to announce sooner rather than later? And you also, right, it's not just the prosecution question. There's also a question about midterms. And some people are saying, well, what if he announces and he makes all the midterms about Trump and now there's not a big red wave? Well, maybe he takes credit for the losses or for a smaller red wave. Or other people are saying, what if he announces and there's a giant red wave and then he takes credit for all of it all? Or maybe it's because of him, right? Maybe he is the cause of a giant red wave or not, right? There's all this gamesmanship that's being played and speculated, and everybody's trying to really, I think a lot of these things, the reality doesn't matter. It's sort of who can come up with the better story. Trump's going to get out there and, I announced early and I'm responsible for the win. Or what happens, right? Another sort of contrarian view is what happens if Trump doesn't announce, there is a giant red wave, and you get all of the mainstream GOPers who come out and they say, see, the party doesn't need Trump anymore. We can win without him. He wasn't even involved in any of these elections and we still crushed the Democrats. Now it's time for Ron DeSantis or whatever the narrative will be. And so she's saying, right, she's in Trump communication, former Trump communications, and she's telling us that they're speculating about all of this, when to announce and when not, because it might deflate or take the air out of some of the prosecution if there is one, whatever this criminal probe ultimately shows.
to this August, if not September. And part of the rationale that they're quietly saying is if he's an announced candidate, Merrick Garland can't take him on. That goes against precedent. You can't. And I think the statement from Merrick Garland was precisely to say, that's not true. Anyone, no one is above the law, whether you're an announced candidate or not. It was very intentional for him to say that.
Okay, so here they're all saying that's not true. You can go and indict a former president. You know, all that is true. I think you can indict a former president. I think there's a distinction there about a sitting president, right? Whether you can indict a sitting president because that sitting president is basically the chief executive officer of the country, right? The chief law enforcement officer. It is the chief executive. So if they are in charge of the Department of Justice, how do you prosecute a sitting president if they are the purveyor of justice, right? The executor of justice. And they've also got the pardon power, which sort of gives them the ability to sort of be outside of the law, right? It's a very precarious question that exists while you're president, but I don't think that there's been any hinting that you can't indict a former president. The question has been, why hasn't it happened? Well, of course, everybody knows. It's because it's a political explosive bomb that would happen. Gerald Ford, when he got in power after Richard Nixon, right, he could have let the floodgates go after him and go open and, you know, all over the place. He didn't pardon him. Just let's get this over with, because there's going to be another investigation when the other party takes power. So we're just going to clear it up. And, you know, that's sort of been the norm, because we don't want political prosecutions, because as Americans, we let the political process act as a check on that power. Now, in order to continue to be victorious in that political process, you got to win elections. And the Democrats are trying a very interesting and new strategy in order to try to gain an upper hand here. And House Democrats are very angry about this because it may result in pro-Trump Republicans winning. As they're now thinking about this probe, as the January 6th committee is communicating this stuff over to the DOJ, what happens if the Republicans take over and they're now the makeup of the J6 committee and they're not cooperating with the DOJ anymore, right? They have their own subpoenas and they're not providing evidence over to the U.S. Attorney's Office that they need in order to conduct their prosecutions. What happens? Political reports, they tell us House Democrats berate a campaign arm of the Democrats over a very dangerous GOP primary scheme. The DCC, the Democratic Congressional Something Committee, is airing ads boosting pro-Trump Republicans in primaries against an incumbent who voted for impeachment. This guy, his name is Meyer. He's one of the few GOP lawmakers who voted to hold Trump accountable over his false claims about the 2020 election. But he's in a blue-leaning state. And he's also a Democratic target this fall. Now, what you can see here is a growing number of House Democrats are seething at their own campaign arm for meddling in a GOP primary to promote pro-Trump election conspiracy theorists after months of warnings that such candidates were a threat to democracy. We have public statements, private chats, different complaints going directly over to the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. Democratic members are aghast that the committee is spending nearly $500,000 buckaroos to air ads boosting Donald Trump-endorsed John Gibbs over Rep. Peter Meyer, who voted to impeach Trump last year. Meyer is one of a few GOP members who did, in fact, vote to hold him accountable, they write. His blue-leaning seat is also a top Democratic target. Democrats like Murphy say there's a strategy that could backfire. They are voting, right? They are funneling money to his primary opponents because they think that if the primary opponent wins, he's going to be easier to beat in the general election. Murphy says many of us are facing death threats over our efforts to tell the truth about J6, and to have people boosting candidates telling people other lies is very dangerous and mind-blowing. And they're not happy about it. Now, I saw a bunch of clips from David Axelrod, who's a former Obama campaign advisor, and others who are screaming about this. The DCC decision to spend $425,000 running an ad that supports a Republican escalates the party's involvement. It was funded by the lawmakers' own membership dues. Do you see what's happening? The Democrats are paying for ads for Republican primary people, because they think that they're going to be easier to beat if they win the primary, that they'll be easier to beat in the general election. So Democrats are like, wait a minute, why are you spending money on Republicans? That's Democrat money. Very interesting times. Now, that is the summation of the Trump criminal probe. We, of course, will see if anything comes of it. Merrick Garland, the J6 committee, and many of the Democrats are still, I think, engaged in a lot of wishful thinking on this topic. They're very excited about a prospective Trump indictment. Whether that comes to fruition, we will see, and we'll continue to follow the Trump criminal probe story, of course.